My name is Amal. I'm an Android developer at Deliveroo in London. I'm going to be the person that keeps you here for the next 40 minutes from getting your lunch. So you've probably also seen our bikes cutting about here in Paris, and I've previously done a version of this talk with Maria, my colleague at DroidCon London, but she was giving a talk last week at DroidCon Turin on dependencies, so she couldn't be here to do this today. So today I'm here alone to share our journey from Java to Kotlin. So my assumption is that you're here because maybe you have played with Kotlin in your spare time, and you're thinking of maybe using it at work, in your day-to-day app. But it's important to understand that working on an app in your spare time and using an app that's a product for a company that it probably depends on are two very different things. There are a lot of important conversations you have to have, and a lot of decisions you have to make as part of that. So I'm here today to try and help you navigate that process, and with the hard part kind of getting started, and then also maybe some common conversion problems you might have along the way, and then how also to get your team on board, because you're not going to be able to do this alone. So yeah, like I said, this is a journey, and no journey is complete without a good map. Here's ours. So from Java to Kotlin. Yes, Java's an island, Kotlin's an island, ha ha ha. Google says it takes about 20 hours and 25 minutes. I mean, I've only got 43 minutes left now, so I don't think we're going to be able to complete this whole thing. But when you come around to doing this, it probably will take a little bit longer than 20 hours. So we started mostly because our app was ballooning with dependencies. And those dependencies, for the most part, were there to try and make our lives a little bit less Java 6. So we had things like auto-value and Lombok. Don't ask why we had both. We had stream support for manipulating collections in a functional manner. We used retro lambda for obvious reasons, and we used butter knife to take the pain out of view binding. Now, we looked at Kotlin and we saw that we could do all of these things at the language level, which meant that if we were to convert everything to Kotlin, we could potentially remove a bunch of these dependencies. But that's a lot easier said than done. And adopting a new language is a huge step. You have to make sure that you have your team and your company on board, because otherwise, going back from this is not going to be easy at all. So we got started with tests. It's pretty low risk. The dependency isn't going to be included in your production APK. The test files themselves are reasonably self-contained. There's nothing too complicated in test classes. They're generally standalone bits of functionality, assert, or arrange, act, assert, or whatever. And even if you get to this point and you decide that, actually, nuts to this, like Kotlin isn't for us, or managers haven't signed off on it, or it's not going to fit in with whatever the way we're doing things, having a couple of tests sitting around in Kotlin is not the end of the world. So we started in June 2016, so nearly a couple of years ago now. And for the most part, using it in tests was a great way to kind of get used to the syntax and get used to a few of the language features. But like I said, tests are just not very exciting. We all like writing tests. We all like think we should write tests. But when it comes to actually writing the code, like the code's pretty boring. But the more we wrote Kotlin in our tests, the more we were like, OK, these features are really cool. I want to use this in the production app. Sometimes finding yourselves writing Kotlin in Java files and wondering why it's not compiling. But then we got more and more frustrated. And so we decided that if we could improve tests, even the simplest code could be improved by a bit of Kotlin, how much could we improve our main app by? So we got started with an away day. We had an engineering away day at work where all the engineers kind of got together at a venue, and we sat down. I gave a quick lightning talk on Kotlin. And this was really pivotal to get started. It was just a brief tech talk covering a few high-level features of the language. And this sparked a pretty big discussion within the Android team. At the time, I think there was about 10 of us or so, and some people were like, why do we need to bother with this? We can do all these features with the dependencies we have already. Google don't support it yet, and all this sort of thing. Why should we bother taking this risk? And I think it's important at this point, like, to point out that, like, don't go rogue. Don't just start writing Kotlin in your app and suddenly expect people to review it and think it's okay. It's not going to fly. I think this happened to me in a previous company where one of my colleague of mine, an iOS colleague, started to write Swift in a project that was entirely Objective-C, and then left, with nobody to maintain it. Instead, it's really important to get people on board. We already had at Deliveroo a format where every 2 weeks, the Android developers would get together for an Android chat. And so more and more we were chatting about Kotlin in this Android hour, and we decided that actually it was worthwhile doing something separate. So rather unimaginatively, we came up with Kotlin Hour, which, yes, is the meeting you actually want to go to. It's, yeah, unlike all these other crappy meetings with product managers. But this is important. The important point here is, like I was saying, it's important not to conflate Android and Kotlin. They are two very distinct things. Kotlin is a language, Android is the platform. If we were to start having those conversations around Kotlin in our Android hour, then we'd end up being a bit more behind on Android, even though we were furthering ourselves with Kotlin. And it's super important to keep on top of both, because we can't start a new language without everyone knowing it. And what happened in Kotlin Hour, there was no real agenda or anything. It actually started with me giving a bit more of a deep dive on, following on from the short tech talk which I gave at our Engineering Away Day. And from that, it opened up this culture of learning where there were no stupid questions. Like, everyone is learning from scratch. And you can, at first we tried doing the Kotlin koans. So they're a great resource if you haven't tried them before. So we just all brought our laptops to Kotlin Hour, got them out, tried out the Kotlin koans, helped each other if we needed to. Then we tried so we have an interview task when we're interviewing new candidates. And so we decided to all sit down and just all do that in Kotlin. It's a simple standalone way to learn about new language features in a way that's completely risk-free from actually affecting any of your code in production. And this really helped to get the team on board. But there was still some skepticism. At this point, we were working on things like instant apps, and we were asking ourselves questions like, do we want to add another dependency? Will our managers approve this? But we looked at the pros and cons, and the community was adopting it at a fairly big level. And Google was supporting it in Android Studio and the build tools, just as a virtue of the fact that Android Studio is built on IntelliJ. So I encourage you to have a similar conversation here, because it's a very important decision and needs a lot of thought. If you need a little bit of inspiration for this, I suggest watching Christina Lee's talk from last year at Google I/O. It's really inspirational. It can describe that conversation a lot better than I could. And with that, we decided we'd go ahead, and Maria made our first pull request in Kotlin. All it was converting just a basic model to a data class. And after that, we were in. We'd boarded our plane to Kotlin. We'd begun our journey. But everyone discovers things at different speeds. So it's really important to find your pace. At first, some of us were writing everything in Kotlin. And some of us were still writing most stuff in Java until we felt a little bit more comfortable switching. And there's no stigma around this at all. It's completely OK to be still writing Java in a Kotlin world. It's absolutely fine. The only single rule we had was no auto-value and Lombok classes, which I'll get to why in a little bit. And then this happened. Kotlin became a first-party language on the platform, and all of our doubts were gone. Our flight had taken off, our 20-hour flight, or whatever it was, and yeah, it was great. It was convert all the things. We were ready to do this. But this is actually where the hard work begins, and it's not a smooth ride. So I'm going to share a few things that worked for us, and hopefully you can take that away, take that back with you, and maybe try and implement some of that as well. So Kotlin Hour, like I said, was super important here. And the agenda for that really varied. At first, I gave a few examples of the things we did in the first few Kotlin hours, but since then, it's still going, and to this day, it is still happening. And there's still no agenda. And every single week we come in, we discuss things we learned, maybe an interesting use of Kotlin, or like a recommendation of something we discovered. Sometimes we'd even just sit down and all go through one code review together, where something particularly interesting in Kotlin was written. But this is only every 2 weeks. And when you're first picking up the language, you need something to keep you going in between each Kotlin hour. So as developers, we write code every day. We also review code every day. And code reviews became one of the pivotal ways to learn Kotlin. So as an author, you might point out an interesting part of the code, or something you've learned, or just ask for help. There's no stupid questions. You're all learning at the same time. Or as a reviewer, you could point out, hey, like, you could make this line a little bit more concise, or just a simpler way of writing something. I personally learned so much from reviewing code. Things like good uses of sealed classes, default implementations and interfaces, and good use of extension functions to clear up boilerplate code. Everyone is on the same journey, and you're going to discover different bits at different times. So here's a couple of examples from comments from our GitHub. Anna here had learned about expression bodies, and so she pointed it out. She said, hey, look, I learned about this thing. It's cool. And then we're like, OK. I mean, now we use it quite a lot. And secondly, Roman had written a type alias, and some of us were like, what's this? I'm not sure what that does. And yeah, he can explain it in the code review. This is huge, I think. Like, you look at this. This is a new concept, and now you can see a real-life use in a code base which is familiar to you. You have immediate access to it. You can just check out that branch, have a play around with it, and see how it works. It's so much more useful than like kind of hello world example or like a basic tutorial. But I know not everybody has numerous colleagues from which you can learn. I know I certainly did that back in the day. I was a solo Android dev, but you're covered as well because you have Android Studio. And Android Studio can help you learn Kotlin as well. It can, a lot of the time, it will suggest quick fixes to make something more idiomatic. Sometimes it's simply just a warning. It's a case of just hitting Alt return or Control return. And sometimes if you're thinking to yourself, oh, this looks a bit cumbersome, there's almost always a better way to do it. And Android Studio can probably help you. So let's look at this example here. Here we've just got this function, mapping IDs, maps to IDs, takes a list of strings, and spits something out. But there's this little underline under the for loop here. So we hit Alt return. Cool. That's a bit neater. It's collapsed that for loop down to a map. But hey, there's still some more we can do here. Oh, cool. That's a little bit neater again. But even at this point, it's not actually highlighted anything, but we can still do one step more. And you can click on the return keyword and hit Alt return, and it will condense it down to an expression body. We could even at this point go one step further and remove the return type, but I suggest leaving the return types in on some on some functions just for readability. But this is a whole lot of magic that's just happened here, that we just hit Alt return a couple of times and it's done some stuff for us. What is actually going on here? So Android Studio does have a tool where you can view the Kotlin bytecode. So you can use this. It's somewhere, I think it's somewhere in the Android tools section. And you're presented with a bunch of bytecode. I'm not sure about you, but I don't find bytecode terribly easy to read. If bytecode is your thing, though, there was a talk at DroidCon London last year by Jake Wharton about sinking your teeth into bytecode. I am not going to cover bytecode today, so there is a button to decompile this back to Java. That's good. That makes it a little bit easier to read. Still not the neatest code in the world, but for the most part, you can see it's doing the same thing. This is pretty much what we wanted. So yeah, that is an accurate conversion. However, this isn't always the case. Like, sometimes you might write code yourself that isn't exactly, and you might think it's beautiful and concise, but behind the scenes, it might not be the best thing to do. There is a bit of a price for this conciseness sometimes, and the compiler isn't perfect. So here's something I wrote recently. I naively assumed that the takeif at the end of this expression would be optimized out by the compiler into an if statement, since it had nothing to do with the previous expression. So I wasn't sure, though. So I decompiled the bytecode, put it back to Java, and I got this. And yeah, sure enough, you look at the bottom there, hey, it's every time it's doing this map function, and then at the end, it's just throwing it away. It's a bit of a waste. So that probably wasn't the smartest way to do this. Interestingly, also, you can see how Kotlin is doing the string interpolation here as well in that while loop. So it turned out that writing something a bit longer and a bit uglier was actually the better way to do this. But how about you? How are you going to actually convert your code? So you're probably going to be using Android Studio. And to do this, you can use the convert Java to Kotlin file in Android Studio, which is Command Option Shift K or Control Alt Shift K, or just sort of mash the bottom left-hand corner of your keyboard and hit K. So what does this do? It's super useful. It'll convert your file, and it gives you a great starting point to continue the rest of the conversion. But it's not perfect. What I should say, though, is that the converter does improve with every Android Studio release. So make sure you're up to date with Android Studio, and you'll get the best results from this. Even then, it's still not perfect. So sometimes you'll do this, and you'll get this dialog pop up. And this tells you that this file cannot be converted in isolation. Essentially, you want to convert this file, you've got a lot more work to do, potentially. So at this point, I suggest hitting cancel is probably the best way to deal with this. Because otherwise, it'll go off and modify all these other files, and it'll pollute your Git staging area and stuff like you don't want that. So yeah, hit cancel, and then you can go and check all those other files and see, like, okay, do I want to convert this file? Do I need to convert this file? Are there other files that I need to convert first before I can come back to this file? It's important. You want to keep your conversions as small as possible. And that way, it's going to make things a lot easier. Otherwise, you're going to end up with what we call conversion creep, which is a bit like scope creep, except it doesn't come from your product manager. And yeah, so next, I'll talk a bit about nullability in Kotlin. Now, one of my favorite features of Kotlin is the nullable types. I thought, woohoo, right? No more null pointer exceptions. Yay. Then, my new friend came along, Kotlin null pointer exception. So yes, Kotlin is 100% interoperable with Java, but some of what you do can get a little bit lost in translation along the way. Here's one that caught us out a few months, maybe last year, I think. So this happened. This is a real bit of our code. It caused a crash. We have this on a interaction listener. It takes these 3 arguments, which we're ignoring using the underscore. And we got a crash report come through. It says, argument specified as non-null is null. What is this? Like, how did this even happen? I'm not even doing anything with these parameters. But it cares. Like, the compiler cares. At runtime, it's checking that so a null key event came in as that 3rd parameter there. And because we've not marked that key event as nullable, it's going to cause a crash at runtime. And so this is a bit worrying, because like this compiled absolutely fine. This was shipped. So the fix here was to essentially take this. Oh, I forgot to do the crazy cat emojis. And turn it into an optional type. And then everything was fine. But the lesson here is to check your Java interface before implementing it in Kotlin. And if you're not 100% sure, try and stick with Nullable. In fact, the Kotlin converter will normally infer nullability if you do if there's a null check done in the function which you're calling, but it's not always perfect. But yeah, but you've not always got null checks and stuff like that. Some things can be passed through. Another thing to say is, in terms of the platform, the most recent Android support library has way more nullability annotations in it. So if you just keep up to date with your support libraries, then you're going to have a much better experience writing Kotlin. And I think this is no longer an actual problem if you do it now. But this will still apply if you are consuming Java interfaces from any of your dependencies. As another one, this is another Kotlin conversion thing that caught us out. The converter tool converted what was a get function into a val. And then this crashed as well, because it evaluated instantiation of the activity, and it couldn't get access to the resources, and so it just crashed. So we converted this to a getter, and then this was OK. But this was a manual step between that convert to Kotlin and then fixing it here. So the next thing is, maybe you're done with your conversion. Now what are you going to do? You're going to check it in, right? But there is a good way to do this. If you can use your version control effectively, your team's going to absolutely love you. It's going to make your life as a team converting to Kotlin so much easier. So one of the sad things about actually converting to Kotlin is that you're going to lose your linear git history of a file. So if you are doing a conversion, be prepared to be git blamed for everything. But I have some tips that will help make this slightly easier. Do your conversion itself. When you actually do the conversion, do it as a single commit. And what I mean by this is, when you actually hit convert Java to Kotlin, do that, convert Java to Kotlin, clean up some of the conversions, make sure it all still works, and then commit it immediately. Do not make any logic changes, do not make any behavioral changes, don't do the thing that you originally planned to do on that file. But this is going to make code review so much easier, because then you can review the change as a separate commit, rather than having to dig through just a huge sea of green on GitHub and trying to figure out what was the new thing that they added again. Like, okay, this function looks the same as it was there. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's super important to do that. And also, merge your conversions quickly. Don't keep big files on long-running branches converted, and then expect to be able to merge that back to your main branch, like master or developer or whatever, because trying to resolve those merge conflicts is a nightmare. My suggestion here is to actually just branch off master or develop and do the conversion and pull request it back, and then rebase your feature branch on top of master again, because then that opens that file up for editing by everybody else, and you're not going to have to deal with huge merge conflicts down the line. Yeah. So yeah, it's important. I said this before about talking about things in your pull request reviews, and the key point here is, yeah, just really, I can't stress this enough. You need to share what you learned. And then, as I said before as well, something about the return types. Leave it in where it makes sense. It's much, much easier to review code that has the return types left in. We don't want to have type inference engines in our heads. It's not take this for example. Did anyone here figure out what this returns? No? Yeah, that's a little bit easier to read now. Yeah, so it costs you nothing to do this. Leaving a return type, you can even, I think there's even an option to be able to add it back in. I mean, this is a reasonably trivial example, but there are a lot worse. So I mentioned issues with Lombok. So anyone here using annotation processors, any of these sort of things? Anyone unfortunate enough to use Android annotations? So we were using all of these except Android annotations. And so we wanted to switch to using capt, or K-A-P-T. I don't know what the right pronunciation is. But one of the big things we came across was the fact that we were using Lombok, and we wanted to start using capt, and they don't work. It just doesn't, like, they are so incompatible. And we had over 100 Lombok files in our code base to convert. And so it was this huge task of having to convert all these value classes to Kotlin, which involved a huge amount of conversion creep as well, because there's a bunch of places where we were calling to builder on these Lombok methods and using builders and building that all up, and it became a bit of a nightmare. So my lesson is don't use Lombok. So what would we change? My suggestion is converting util classes early. So we did this reasonably late. I mean, you've probably got a bunch of these, like string utils, view utils, and you can replace these with, for the most part, extension functions. And these extension functions are in like just a wrapper class. So sorry, there is no wrapper class, like unlike the Java like utils object. It's just a bunch of extension functions at the file level. And the file name here doesn't matter either. Like we just ended up calling our files stuff like string extensions and view extensions and stuff like that. So an example here is using this view.show for show view. And what's really cool here is that if you start converting your utils classes first, you're not going to have to change any of your Java files. If you use these JVM name annotations, then your Java classes will consume these new extension functions exactly as they did before. So this is like one of the best conversions you can do to start with. And also, if you do this early, you avoid actually having to go back and change any Kotlin files. So this is the mistake we made, where we left these files till quite late, and then when we did convert them, we had to go and change all the Kotlin files afterward as well, which ended up adding a bit more pain to it. But like, it's super important to just stress, like, do what works for your team. Like, you can all convert really quickly, or do stuff at a slower pace. Like, start with what excites you. Like, choose that class that's really bothering you the most, like, and tackle that. It's really important to have these conversations with your team and management and work together to learn Kotlin faster, because if you can learn something together, you're going to learn it a lot faster than you did trying to do it alone. So the end kind of result here is that this is more like, this is a bit more accurate of our journey. There is no magic flight. And we are now about 2/3 of the way there. I think we're like something like 67% Kotlin now. But yeah, we started with tests 2 years ago. You don't have to. Start with those util classes, seriously. But yeah, have the necessary conversations and get your team excited. So I hope I could give you some insight on what you can expect and how you can get across Asia. We have absolutely no regrets in doing it, and I hope you don't either. So it's a long process, but it's totally worth it. Thank you. I think we've got time for questions. Yeah, we've got loads of time for questions. Cool, early lunch.
With the example where you had a unused parameter, but it was still null checking it, if you don't specify the type on that, does it still null check it?
On that specific example, like, you had to specify the type because it was a Java interface. I don't think you could, yeah, you had to basically implement that as an object. So, yeah.
Yeah, so over here.
Hi.
A challenge if you convert files to Kotlin is that Git may not pick it up in the file history. So how do you deal with that?
So we've tried a couple of different ways of doing this. It won't track, like I said, yeah, you'll lose that linear Git history when you convert to Kotlin. We tried a few different ways of, like, first doing like a Git rename, so Git move, change the file, and still with all the Java code to .kt, and then run the conversion, because the conversion tool itself ditches the old file and creates a new one. But in the end, when you look at the diff, every line is changing anyway. So trying to establish like when a certain line changed, or trying to use like git blame or anything like that, or annotate your file to see when that last change happened, it's always going to end up hitting that Kotlin conversion, because you're pretty much going to change every line. So there's not really much you can do to preserve that history. It's probably easier to actually just leave it as it was and go back to the point where it was a Java file, and then navigate your Git history that way.
Okay, thanks.
Hi.
Thanks for presentation.
Thanks.
I have two questions. The first one is, how are you checking the style and the code style of Kotlin? Like, do you use a specific linter? And the second one is, I forgot.
So the first one, we have started to use the code style check that Roman and Chet mentioned this morning. So yeah, we're using that, and we haven't, for long and boring reasons, haven't actually enabled like linting yet on our project. We had to disable it for something, I can't remember why now. But yeah, we do have a code style check, and we share that file so that we all have the same code styles when we check in.
Okay, the second question, I remember it. Do you use Kotlin like for in a way like functional programming, or you kept the object-oriented programming like what you have with Java?
I think this is completely up to you as to how you want to do it. I think in some places we are switching to more kind of declarative, like functional style things, because Kotlin can allow you to do that. So we, for example, as part of our architecture, we have these converters that convert presenter state to view state, and they are functional because the converters themselves have no state. They should take some input and give some output. And yeah, so in those cases, we try and write things as declaratively as possible, which makes it easier to read and easier to test. But yeah, it's completely up to you whether you want to go. One thing I would suggest against is writing Kotlin that looks like Java. So like, for example, ignoring the writing inits everywhere, or writing constructors and declaring all your vals at the root level of the class, things like that. Declare them in the constructor itself on the first line.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Enjoy lunch. Cheers.